2 weeks ago, I turned 60. I know you don't care. But I had told my wife, look, don't give me anything. I got enough stuff, right? But she can't help herself, so she got me a bowl of York patties, which, okay, it's got meaning because I love York patties. And my daughter, who knew that I turned 60, she sent me a whole box. Is that not sweet? You see the little red hearts and everything? Isn't that cute? Now my staff, okay, here at the museum, they got me 3. And I have 7 people that report to me, so if you cut these in half, that's a little less than half a York per person. And I guess that story could have turned out better. Tonight we'll talk about one that does. This is true. Our topic tonight is Seen and Unseen, photographs of Imogen Cunningham. Now, for those of you that have heard me speak before, is that most of you? You know that I like to back way, way up, usually a couple thousand years. Tonight, just 150, maybe, to begin our story. Middle of the 19th century. Paintings are it. Paintings dominate cultural meaning. I mean, if you want to tell a big, big story, the way to do it is through a painting. TV doesn't exist. Radio doesn't exist. Most people are illiterate. Images are the primary carrier of cultural meaning. This is by Gustave Courbet, and it's about my life as an artist. And it's huge, and it's all his flunkies from his studio, his pets, and of course his model, and admiring fans, and they're all admiring his genius. Have you ever known an artist with a big ego? They exist. Gustave was one. Let me tell you something about Gustave. He fancied himself a great painter, but as soon as photography was invented, which was just a couple of decades, not even, before this was painted, he was all over it. And he wasn't just a painter. He was using photography as a tool. And there it is. He took a lot of different photographs, and you can be sure that this one on the left, that photograph also existed, didn't survive, but this one did. Photographers instantly saw the what? The efficacy, right? The opportunity of having photographs to use to establish their imagery. And so they're on it right away. And it's not going to be just one. It's going to be all of them, basically. And the camera is seen early on as a tool. This is a scientific thing. It captures images, but we're the artists. Painters are the artists. And that attitude of painting being the real art and photography merely being a tool and a hobby is going to stay for decades. Among the artists who gravitate towards photography early on, who would have guessed? Van Gogh. Not a whole lot, because Van Gogh didn't, carry around a camera. Guy had problems. Degas. Shocks a lot of people to find out, well, I thought he just made those up. I thought the Impressionists caught things in a moment. If you're a model and you try to hold this pose, do you think you can hold that pose in a moment? You have obviously never modeled. This particular pose, it hurts a lot. Cameras allow you to do things you couldn't do. Cézanne, father of modern art, big fan of using photography in his work. You can bet they used a lot more than what survives. A lot of artists destroyed their photographs so as to give the impression that they never used it. Those were going to be, you just sort of have to guess, but they're out there. Lautrec. I was personally a little dismayed. I thought he had a model leg up in the shoe. Anyway, that's all right. When photographers finally get around to trying to be accepted as creators in their own right, as artists in their own right, what they have to do, unfortunately, is try to look like painters in order to gain respect and to gain the kind of critical acclaim that they want to claim. This is Clarence White at the turn of last century, in 1902. A lovely picture, women out in the field picking some kind of apple or fruit of some kind off of the ground. There were 1 million of these done in the 19th century. Very romantic, it's an idyll, they're not really workers. They're out having a pleasant afternoon in the sun-dappled world, and he gives us a photographic version of that. It's a photograph that bends towards being like a painterly composition. This is going to get a name, and it's going to be called pictorialism. It's photographs that really bend towards photographs. or excuse me, to bend towards paintings. And the man who is going to promote photography at the turn of the century more than anybody else is this guy, Alfred Stieglitz. He's a friend of Clarence White's, and every other artist who lives knows him, wants to be around him from time to time, wants to be shown by him. And Stieglitz's big love is photography, and he's going to promote it incessantly. And he himself is a photographer. And early on, no surprise, he's very much a pictorialist. This is Stieglitz in 1902, Hand of Man. And what do you do to make a photograph look more like a painting? Make it soft, gauzy, fuzzy, indistinct at the edges, feathered the way a painting would look, tonal, the way a painting might look if it were done by George Inness or someone like that. Even sometimes manipulate the surface of your image by hand to make it look more painterly. So this Stieglitz in 1902, looking very much like this guy in the upper left, Garrett Saint-Lazare, Claude Monet. You can see what I'm talking about by pictorialism. Stieglitz looking very much like a painter. Now here's a question. Did Monet use a photograph to make that painting? My guess would be probably. Did he save those? Nah. Here's Stieglitz once again, 1893, Winter, Fifth Avenue, and a painting of basically the same place by Child Hassam. Amazing how much they are looking at each other. But it's really the photographers who have the lower rung. They're trying to be like the painters. And here is Gertrude Kasebier doing a really lovely, lovely photograph. Blessed art thou among women. This is a published photograph. It becomes hugely popular. I think many of you have probably seen it before. And she, again, very much being a pictorialist, she looks at paintings like this by Mary Cassatt, but she also looks at the pre-Raphaelites and a lot of other, mother and child images. A pictorialist photograph is staged. It is composed like a painting. It is softened like a painting, right? There's nothing instantaneous really or off the street or off the cuff about it. It's very formalized. Okay, so this gets published, and all the way across the country from New York, there is an America there. New Yorkers haven't discovered it, but you go all the way west, in the Pacific Northwest, where they had mail, came on horses, but nonetheless there it was. This photograph is seen by a young woman named Imogen Cunningham. And what's critical about this is it's a photograph of a woman by a woman, and it's beautiful, and it's accomplished. And Imogen knows all of this stuff, and it inspires her in this very specific way. I can do that, she thinks. I can do that. So the importance of example, we can never underestimate that. And she is going to jump right into photography. She doesn't have a camera. Family doesn't have a camera. There's nowhere to even get a camera where she is in the Pacific Northwest. Amazing. She mails off to Scranton, Pennsylvania, and buys a box camera for the extraordinary sum of $5. It was a lot of money. And her father is going to build her a little dark room on the family farm. He doesn't necessarily want her to be a photographer, but he loves his daughter, and he promotes, encourages her ambitions, thinks maybe she'll grow out of it. And he is going to jump right in. And her first photograph is going to be among her first photographs, is going to be very pictorialist. This is a self-portrait. Now, for those of you that were in the little talk earlier, you already know what she does. She's on the campus of the University of Washington, sets up her big box camera, right, on the tripod with a timer, and takes off all her clothes on campus and jumps into this thing and shoots it. And as we were saying earlier, for those of you who weren't there, it takes an extraordinarily self-confident young woman to do something like this in 1906, and that was Imogen. Very self-confident, very passionate about what she was doing. She would have maybe been an art major at the University of Washington. There was no art department. So instead, she majored in chemistry, took a lot of chemistry classes. That's what art majors do. They take a lot of chemistry. And so her first inclinations are very much like this, looking very much like painters that she had seen in magazines. Maybe she hadn't seen this very specific painting, but there were tons of them just like it. If you look at the history of art, and I bet a bunch of you have, what would the history of art be without naked women cavorting around outside? It would just be bereft. 1907, 08, she gets out of college and she starts working at a photography studio recently established in Seattle, the Edward Curtis Studios, and she prints these photographs. They're platinum prints, and she goes in every day and she masters the art of platinum printing. So sometimes when you're looking at an Edward Curtis photograph, probably printed by the very, very young Imogen Cunningham, working her way up. Her sorority from school says, you need to be bigger than this. You need to be doing more than this. They give her a scholarship to go to Europe, and she goes to Germany, and she studies further chemistry, and she does a master's thesis on using lead salts instead of platinum on photographic surfaces, which I don't understand, but she wrote this. Around 1908, 1909, she publishes it. It's rather extraordinary. Learns to speak German. You think she might not come back to the Pacific Northwest? She does. She comes back in 1910, and she establishes a photography studio at that time. And she still is very much in this pictorialist mode. Soft, gauzy, kind of symbolic looking, a face that you know, could step right out of a pre-Raphaelite painting. That's what she's doing. But she's very good at it. And she's on her own, she's unmarried, and she's running her own business. Extraordinarily independent. This is another kind of painting that she does, or photograph she does in 1910, The Supplicant. If you're getting people to undress for you outdoors in 1910, you're a radical. You just are. And if men are in the mix, it's a dangerous deal because it's twice as dangerous as the nude woman photograph. But she is successful in getting this done, and again, she creates these images in this very narrative form, very much like an old Corot painting from the 19th century, nymphs cavorting, spirits in the trees and the wind blowing around, and very romantic, very pictorialist. It's really lovely. 1913, still not married yet, she publishes an article on photography as a profession for women. Why does she do that? Because at that time, it was supposed that women were not supposed to have any profession whatsoever. Remember, this is a time, for some of you younger people out there, women still do not even have the vote yet. And she writes this article and she publishes it in 1913 as a very young woman. And I hope you're reading most of it, but I want to point out this one part, second sentence. Women are not trying to outdo men by entering the professions. They are simply trying to do something for themselves. Seems rather reasonable. Makes her a little radical. She does get married in 1915. She marries an artist named Roy Partridge. She marries Roy because Roy is an artist. He's kind of free-spirited. She thinks that at the time, he'll understand me. We are birds of a feather. He'll understand and appreciate my independence. That was true for a long time, not forever, but for a long time. And instead of getting women to run around naked out in the woods, she talks him into doing it. So early on in the marriage, things are going well, and he does what he's told, and that's to hang out naked by a pond. And that is Roy. She does a whole series of him. Again, very much a pictorialist adventure, trying to create a narrative in a soft, gauzy, atmospheric mode. The thing that Imogen does with Photograph of a Naked Man is in 1916, among the very first of these she did, she publishes it in the paper in Seattle, a little paper called the Town Crier, if you can believe, in the Christmas issue, 1916. She thought that was her gift to the community. And the little subtitle, be sure to look at the reflection in the water. So it causes an enormous stir. She's not going to be showing nudes there for a long, long time. And I think she and Roy realized that perhaps their future in Seattle is going to be somewhat circumscribed by an aesthetic narrowness. They might be right about that. And they moved to San Francisco around 1920. And Roy is going to get a job at Mills College. And the other thing that they do is they have children. And she's going to have first one at about 17, and then she has twins a couple years after that. So she winds up with 3 little boys. And the shadow of Rondell is here behind this bird cage. And so she winds up staying at home with the kids anyway. And Roy is off teaching at Mills College. And she thinks, well, what can I shoot? Because she does not want to stop making photographs. She doesn't feel that motherhood is an automatic, you're done. So she photographs the kids, and she photographs things that are inside the house. And increasingly, she's going to photograph things that are around the house. Why not? No reason to stop. And one of the things that's right outside her back door is this. And she figures she can keep entering exhibitions. Why not? She becomes a member of the Pictorialist Society of America, and she enters shows in the San Francisco Bay Area. She always gets in. So even though her life has changed, she is active. She continues to subscribe to camera work, photographic journals of every kind that she can get her hands on. So she's aware. She's aware of what's going on nationally. She's aware of what's going on locally. And in this photograph, you can see there's a turn happening away from pictorialism towards the clarity of objects. Single object. Looks romantic, sure, because it's a big flower. But she's more and more interested in what a camera can do, not what a painter might do, and how I can translate that into a photograph. What is the camera capable of doing? It's capable of capturing lots of data, moving it onto a negative, and replicating it with extreme quality, right, in terms of clarity, precision, exactitude. And she's able to do that. That's where that interest is heading. Slowly, in the mid-20s, but definitely away from pictorialism. And this is another example, both of these in the show, from the mid-20s. Another thing that she does is when she goes to shows and she enters shows, subscribes to magazines, she meets other photographers. There aren't that many in the 20s in California. She's going to meet them, though, the ones that are there. In California at the time, what dominates the art scene? Paintings, like they do from coast to coast. This is an extremely typical kind of West Coast painting. William Wendt. That is Highway 1. For those of you that have driven Highway 1 in Los Angeles, that is it. It has changed. You're looking at it like, where is that part? That's right outside of Laguna. So William Wendt is the president of the California Art Club. There are thousands of members. He controls most of the exhibitions in the Southland, a great many in the North. This is what dominates California art. And in the North, the dominant painter is Arthur Matthews. He also likes oceans and trees and clouds, as does William Wendt. But he also has that same nymph outside sensibility. This is a nymph in California. I grew up in California. I went to the beach all the time. I never saw this. I would remember. But looking very much like Imogen's photographs, which look very much like the 19th century. This is, again, a recycling of themes and models that have been around for quite some time, remaining very popular in California through the 20s, into the 30s, in fact. This is the most popular pictorialist photographer in Northern California at the time. And it's an example by Anne Brigman. She's got the stormy sky, the very silverish background. The wind is blowing, and of course you've got the nudes that are there. And something that's fascinating is, and I think you can see this, you see this halo making this figure look very holy and very saint-like? She manipulates that. It's not in the photograph. She goes back and paints it in. Pictorialists will do that to get this painterly effect. So Anne Brigman, most popular pictorialist in the North, and of course Imogen's well aware of who she is. And she continues to do a few things that look, like mountains and being in the mountains, and that's her husband Roy, the eternal model, this time with clothes. He doesn't usually paint naked. But by 1928, this is Imogen. And her interest in shapes and clarity and forms all by themselves is more fully present than ever. So her turn away from pictorialism is suddenly manifest in a very, very big way. This is called Triangles. It gives you a sense of what she was looking for in this photograph. If you look, here, of course, is a triangle, seems to be pointing to the right. Here is a triangle, almost an exact triangle, seems to be pointing this way. In the very middle of this, almost middle, is almost a perfect triangle. It just happened. And she's interested in the kinds of things that can happen when you look at things just as they are and don't manipulate the negative and don't necessarily pose your model. Just sit the model down and see what happens. And this is going to fascinate her more and more, and it will become her dominant mode for a couple of decades. And part of the reason for this is going to be an artist that she meets. This is a photograph, how do you like that? Portrait of Imogen by a guy she meets in the 20s, early 20s, Ed Weston, who takes her photograph. She meets Weston, they hit it off, they have a lot of similar interests, and he's a little bit of a pictorialist early in his career, but he's losing interest in it more and more. They're friends, and they're going to stay friends, talk about their work, look at each other's work. And this is Ed Weston in 1927. This is not pictorialism. Single object, centered, empty background. No nymphs, no cherubs, no outdoors, nothing. It's just a long time exposure. And if you've ever seen this photograph in the flesh, the detail is rather extraordinary. I can't remember, maybe there's a photographer here who remembers. I think the exposure was like 4 hours. It's extraordinary. He's focused on the object and the clarity of the object and the forms in the object the way it is. He has a big show, 1927 in San Francisco. Of course, Imogen sees it, and that has a big influence on her. This is another 1927 Weston. Painters rarely cut the heads off their models. Photographers can manipulate things in a way that painters cannot. And so here is Weston from 27 and Imogen right on the heels of Weston, a very similar aesthetic. Dead on, unmanipulated, what do the forms have to tell us? And here's this guy, Ansel Adams. He's hanging around in the Bay Area too. And in 1927, there's a photographer named Willard Van Dyke who goes to Weston's 1927 show. He introduces Weston to Adams, who in turn gets introduced to Imogen. So all these photographers in that area wind up knowing each other. Adams is working towards a very similar aesthetic. Shooting something, but in this case, the great outdoors, dead on, unmanipulated, straight. And this is going to be the name given to this kind of photography. Straight photography as opposed to pictorialist. Things as they are as opposed to manipulating something to look like a painting. And this is Ansel. He likes the big stuff. He's a guy that has a little bit of an ego, as we'll discover, but he's central to forming the group. Imogen is central to forming a group. They get together often with Ed, with Willard Van Dyke, with a couple of other photographers, and they say, what we need to do is be a group. And we'll call ourselves F64. And F64 comes from the aperture on a camera. It's an f-stop, and it's the stop with which you can get the greatest depth of field and the greatest clarity of things. And so that's what they call themselves, and they share this vision for what photography can be. Quit trying to be artsy, just shoot the world. So right around that time, Imogen gets hired by Vanity Fair to do some photography. And the assignment is going to be to go to Hollywood, because in the 30s, Hollywood is all the rage, and it stays popular even to the present day, does it not? And everybody's interested in the stars. And she says, well, I don't want to shoot stars. I don't want to do makeup, lighting, special costumes. And they said, well, what do you want to shoot, Imogen? And she told them, and I love this, she said, I want to shoot ugly men. And they said, what do you mean by that? And she said, I want to shoot them without all the trappings, just the way I find them. And they said, well, we will take a chance on you, and we'll do that. So she goes to Hollywood, and the first ugly man she finds is Cary Grant. And she goes to his house. They're in his house, and she says, this is a bit ridiculous. And he says, I know, I rented it, I hate it. So let's get out of here, let's go outside. And he says, well, don't I need a coat and a tie and all blah, blah? No, just you. And, well, what do you want me to do? She said, well, how about you just sit down? And so he does. And what's absolutely fascinating about this for 1932 is no smile, okay? And I pointed this out to the earlier group, so they're all educated and know what's coming. They weren't all that impressive, but they know what's coming. Notice this ambient shadow just falls right across his face in an unusual way. Never would have happened in a studio photograph. His hair, it's nicely combed. It doesn't shine. nothing shiny about it. And no suit, no tie, open collar, and really nothing sexy about it, no smile. I don't find it to be ugly, but it's just very direct, very natural. And Vanity Fair is going to love it. Now, let's compare it to what I'm talking about, to something that is not a straight photograph. Same guy, same time period, all right? Shiny hair, suit, and the lighting is perfectly even. Also, hints of makeup, all right? You could almost think it was a different person. Straight photograph, glamour photograph. Now, this is my own dark little thought. You will all have your own opinions about what I'm about to say. But Cary, love his face, has a deep, deep cleft in his chin. And that's not a shadow. And over here, his hand is strategically placed. It hides that cleft. 1931, do you think people were cynical enough to think that a cleft was a defect? Maybe. Why have a distraction in a photo? Why take the chance? Just cover it. We'll just model it. See. So maybe even Cary Grant isn't perfect. And if Cary Grant's not perfect, I want to die. So I'm serious. All right, Spencer Tracy. Little quick test. Is there any young people in the audience at all? I see a couple in the back. Who has not heard of Spencer Tracy? Raise your hand. Oh my God, there is one. Is there just one? Okay, it's okay. We're not going to laugh at you. She's right there. Okay, right there. Glasses. Want to stand up? No, don't. It's okay. It's okay. Time passes. Spencer Tracy, one of the biggest actors ever in Hollywood. And you hardly ever see Spencer this way. I mean, quite natural. You know, sleeves rolled up. Look at this shadow falling across his face. Imogen does this. Okay? And then this is our studio guy. Shiny hair. The weird thing about this particular photograph is that there's no cigarette. You go back in time, there's almost always a cigarette because they are paid by cigarette companies to promote smoking. Every one of them has a contract from some cigarette maker. All right, George Harrell on the left, the most dominant Hollywood photographer of the 1930s. This is Jean Harlow. I'm not even going to ask if you have heard of Jean Harlow because I already know, right? That's okay. Jean Harlow, magnificent dress, platinum hair, beautifully applied makeup. She brought her polar bear with her, the dead one. Am I saying that this is glamour? What glamour photography is about for Hollywood, am I saying it's a bad thing? Well, I actually quite like this. It's beautiful, I think, but it's all about illusion. It's about magic. It's about being compelling. Let's get people to come to, they want to come to the movies for escape, and they want to see stars, people that are bigger than us, that are better than us, that are special in every way. And that's Jean Harlow. She's just amazing. So you do all this stuff. And yet here's somebody that actually had talent was Frida Kahlo. And she's shot by Imogen Cunningham in a hotel lobby with the clothes that she normally wears, just standing there. And I find it a dramatically compelling thing. Why? Because people are interesting the way they are. That's what she thought. And that's what she was doing. So she's going to have a big, big impact with F-64, as Weston will, as Adams will, and the other F-64 photographers for doing this kind of work. So this is Imogen in 1932. Very different than she was. 1932, this is the very year of the one show that F-64 will ever have. 1932, one show. They got together, they wrote a manifesto, and they say in their manifesto that photography should only be what is produced by the capabilities of a camera. Anything that looks pictorialist, and they use that word in their manifesto because everybody knew what it meant back then, pictorialist work was dishonest. That's not what a camera does. That's what a painter does. So you need to be doing what you are doing. So this is very, very much a straight photograph, however romantic. And this is a little bit of audience participation. For those of you who know the answer already, don't answer and look like you're all smarty pants. Who did this photograph? I said don't answer if you know the answer. Ansel Adams did this. This is Fred McElveen, ladies and gentlemen. He doesn't listen to me. He doesn't listen to anybody. That's his wife. Ansel Adams does a big flower. None of you would have guessed that for an Ansel Adams. But Adams says in 1932, when they do their manifesto, it's like, look, we're not saying there are rules that you have to do nudes or you have to do still life or you have to do landscape. You can do whatever you want, but do it straight. Use the camera. The camera can allow you this kind of detail, this kind of up-close look, this kind of clarity, this kind of physical tightness. You can engage that object so much more deeply and intimately because the camera lets you do that. And that's Ansel Adams. They have the show. Everybody in the show gets to have 8 photographs. Ansel gets to have 12. Everybody in the show sells their photographs for $10. Adams get to go for $15. That's just how that went. Because why? Because he is Ansel Adams. That is the answer to that question. One of the other members of the group, Sonia Noskowiak, completely forgotten today, a wonderful photographer. This is a portrait of Babs Pinkerton. Nobody's heard of her. That's okay. I won't make you feel embarrassed. Straightforward. No costume, no special lighting, outdoors, looking one direction, bam, she shoots it. Anybody who know who this is? Langston Hughes, the poet. And what's interesting about the F-64 artists is that they are not really hung up by a lot of things that society around them is hung up about. They don't mind taking photographs of nudes. You're going to see more of those tonight. And they don't mind hanging out with African Americans either, which in the 30s was maybe, if you were white, not the first thing that you were going to do that day. The F-64 photographers don't feel that. And Imogen is going to be particularly interested in photographing civil rights several decades later. Willard Van Dyke, these are ovens on the left in Taos, New Mexico. What's fascinating about this is these almost abstract forms. You wouldn't have any idea what they were until somebody told you. And this is a shot of an interior, obviously. Henry Swift ought to be famous for these extraordinarily abstract black and whites that he called mathematical propositions. John Paul Edwards, street shots, just very dead on, almost reportage, just looking at what's happening in the street. No special effects. And then back to Imogen. She meets Martha Graham, the famous dancer. One day she spends with Martha Graham. Never sees her again. Never saw her before. They meet in Montecito. By the way, Montecito just fell off the map in California. It's that very place where they were hanging out in 1931. And she says, how about we do some photographs? They go outdoors, and she's able to capture this. What are we going to do? Stand there and be yourself. And, of course, Martha Graham is an expressive dancer, a really extraordinary, emotion. And she falls rather naturally into these poses, and Imogen captures them. So the group, they have this one big show. 2 years later, they're done. They are broken up. And they all go their own ways. Some move here to the east. Others stay out west. Some do more photography than others. But they all were just too independently minded to belong to a group. And Imogen certainly was. And in the 30s, besides, it was really hard to do anything. Let's remember the Depression was in full swing by 1934. 25% of all eligible workers in America are out of work. There's a lot of desperation around. Imogen would walk the streets. This is a street photograph that she took, and she decided she really was not going to do this because she felt it exploited people's misery. And however much there was documentary value to it, she didn't like it. So when you look through the whole body of her work, you'll find a couple of these, and that's it. And she realized that this guy didn't elect to be a model, and he didn't elect to be this way, and I'm not doing it. But she was fully aware of the depression that was around her, for sure. So this was a more typical thing to film to shoot during the 1930s, a big pile of junk. And I can guarantee you in 1935, there was no market for photographs of big piles of junk. You could go anywhere and find a big pile of junk for free and actually take it home with you if you wanted to. But Imogen, singular vision, again, very independent. And it's in this year, it's at this time. The kids are big. She wants to travel more. And Roy says, I know I'm an artist and I know you're an artist, but you got to stay home with me. And she says, no, we're not going to do that. And she divorces. Allegedly, they stay in love for the rest of their life, which I like that part of this story. I hope that that is true. But she's going to divorce. She's going to travel widely, making photographs. Into the next decade, in the 40s, she's doing more street photography, but again, not of desperate people, lying down in the street, but more like this, people that are out doing something. This is in San Francisco, and it's people that are attending an evangelical meeting. She's going to call these, though, she's going to call them stolen photographs. And the reason she calls them stolen is because she doesn't pay these people, and they're out there on the street, and she knows it's okay legally, to shoot somebody out on the street, photograph them out on the street. But she feels like she's taking something from them, and so, she feels a little bit bad about that, and she calls them stolen photographs. That attitude, that sensitivity, I think we can say fairly has completely disappeared in our own time. No one cares. If you're outside, you're being photographed. And she returns to Ansel Adams in the 50s, her old buddy. Do you think she has captured something here of his arrogance? This is Mr. $15, you are 10. And here's a very different face on the street. Sunbonnet woman, 1950. And she was able to just find a face, see a face, and stop and say, do you mind? And get this shot that shows a maturity, a wisdom, a life of hard work all in one place. And she lets the camera do that, tell that story. She directs it, she finds it, she's the mediator. That's a magnificent photograph. Vanity Fair. This is the magazine, right, that Imogen worked for. 1991, still taking risks. They put a photograph of a very pregnant Demi Moore on the cover in 1991. You all remember this, right? Oh, yeah. Somebody in the back says, oh, yeah, it was a big deal. A pregnant woman. Can you believe it? It was just amazing, because everything is amazing. And so the shot is made, and it's going to be replicated many, many times, just ad nauseum. And so you get stuff like this, more Demi Moores. And I want you to, I want you to see the claims here. Pay attention to this, right? An iconic pose, and it's Annie Leibovitz. Groundbreaking. And what does groundbreaking mean? It means it's never been done before. No photographs of a pregnant woman. It's done over and over, and this gives birth to the modern maternity portrait. Vanity Fair does that. It gives birth to. So everybody does a version of this. God, that's my favorite. Now, he would feel very bad if you were laughing at him. He put himself out there for this. How about this? Oh, it's amazing how that laughter just stopped. Bam, on a dime. 1959, many years before Annie Leibovitz, Imogen Cunningham giving us a dead-on shot of a pregnant woman. No hands hiding the vital parts. No shame. That's just a clever pose. This is it. This is what this looks like. She did a whole series on pregnant women. Vanity Fair would have not put this on the cover. They weren't going to be that groundbreaking, right? That was just a claim. It was just hype. This preceded them greatly. So on the left, glamour. We have controlled lighting, lots of makeup, even lighting, a clever pose. A shockingly huge ring. It's not lost on me. Glamour, straight. The straight completely forgotten. It was groundbreaking. Me and Annie, just wanted you to know I didn't, wasn't dissing her. We're buddies. Imogen Cunningham, into the 60s. How old is she now? 78. 78 years old in 1961. And she's working, and she does a self-portrait. This is her. Her head would be right about her here. And there's a sign back here that says Youthcraft. So Youthcraft, if you buy Youthcraft, it holds everything in that needs to be held in, and then, of course, you'll be young. And she was witty, she was humorous, she was self-deprecating. She's like, I'm in this photo, I'm 78, and there was just something funny about putting her head right in the underwear. It's not going to help me. I find it enormously charming that she could poke fun at herself at 78. Keep working. 1963. Civil rights is, erupting all over the place. This is not the Deep South. It's not New York. It's San Francisco. And Imogen is there. She'd be 80. She's out on the street. She gets some incredible shots. This look, this woman is looking, she must be looking straight at Imogen. It's such an interesting interchange that's happening. But it's sort of this face, for some reason, that captures my imagination, leaning, thinking, pensive, almost a spiritual weight going on in that head. I don't know. The thing about photographs is they are what they are. And when you start looking at it, you think what you think. She's well aware of how this works. Haight-Ashbury in the 60s. I heard, don't repeat this, I heard they did drugs. Some. A love-in 1968. She's in her 80s and she's going to a love-in. You gotta love it. You just have to love it. So she's at a love-in at Humboldt State. Get some great photographs there. She keeps working. 1970, she does This Is Rather Stark and Rather Different, and it's his head between the legs of a doll. And at this time, many of you here will remember this, we're still right in the middle of the Vietnam War. That war won't end for a number of years. It was the first war that came to America on the television screen. Everybody saw it every night. Imogen is very, very anti-war. And I think she was responding really rather directly to this photograph that came out in 1970. And I think she's playing off of it. She would have never taken this photograph. She wouldn't exploit people's misery that way. But she saw how powerful it was in making a statement about the war, and she respected that. And her version is this is what we are doing to our children? This is how it's going to be? Stridently anti-war, but subtle in her approach to opposing it. And this is Bobby LeBerry, 1976. And by this time, Imogen is 90, whatever she is. She's in her 90s. And she's born in 1883, so if somebody would do the math for me and tell me how much that is. 95, 96? 93? Thank you. She's 93, and she's working on a book called People Over 90. And so this is a woman over 90, photographed by Imogen, who is over 90. And Bobby was in a home, and this is a nude. This is not a dress. These are all tattoos. And she had been, in the 19th century, in the 1890s, she had been part of a circus. And for those of you who either never knew, the freak show was a real thing in circuses, and it was called the freak show. And you had all kinds of things that people would gawk at. If you had something with two heads, that was gold, right? Until it died. That was just absolute gold. But one of the things people always wanted to see was a bearded lady, because that's freakish, or a tattooed lady. And there was a very popular song of the time. Does anybody here know it? Because it's a great song. Lydia, the tattooed lady. Anyway, it was popular. And I could sing it for you, but I'm not going to. And because tattooed ladies were considered freaks. Not today. If you want to see one, go buy a cup of coffee. All right? But this is what Bobby's life was. She had to do it. She felt everybody had to make a living. This was the way she could do it. She tattooed herself, and she was gawked at by people for years in a freak show. But she didn't die. She lived, and she lived past 90. And Imogen was talking to her about all that stuff, and she was past 92. So again, just like when she started her career in 1906, it's a woman looking at a woman, not making any apologies for the life they had, and not making any judgments about it, and not telling you how to think about it, but the photograph is going to let you have your own thoughts anyway. Like, this was your life. Life happens. Things happen. And Imogen was around to photograph every bit of it. So what I'd like you to take away from this talk, from this show, is go into the show, see a lot of incredibly well-crafted photographs of every different kind of subject matter, and see the work of somebody who embraced the world, no matter how ordinary or how odd or how controversial. She embraced every little bit of the world. She just did it through her camera. And looking at her work makes you realize you can embrace every little bit of the world too. It's just up to you. Thank you for listening.